On the afternoon of Sunday, March 6, 1988, an IRA bomb team consisting of 31-year-old Marriott Farrell, 30-year-old Danny McCann, and 23-year-old Sean Savage drove from Marbella, Spain to the UK territory of Gibraltar to mount a deadly attack. The plan was to leave a car bomb outside the governor's residence in Gibraltar, where a changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled for Tuesday morning, when soldiers and a military band would parade in front of the governor's palace while members of the public watched. The goal of the brazen attack was to revive IRA morale, following the disastrous Enniskillen bomb the previous November, when 10 innocent Protestant civilians and a police officer were blown to pieces while they honored the dead on Remembrance Day. And so the deranged intent of the Gibraltar bombing would be to make up for the death of innocents by killing Crown forces, and also the innocents who watched. Sean Savage led the way in his white Renault, while Farrell and McCann tailed in a red Ford Fiesta for the hour-long journey. But what they didn't know was that undercover Spanish police were behind them, relaying their every movement to British intelligence in Gibraltar, who had known about their plan for weeks. Sean Savage then drove the white Renault through Spanish and British checkpoints under a false passport and entered Gibraltar just before 1 p.m. Why British officials did not stop Savage's car is up for debate to this very day. But as Savage drove deeper into Gibraltar, a peninsula with one way in and one way out, plain-clothed SAS men tracked his every movement. As Savage parked his car outside the governor's palace in the Old Town, exited the vehicle, and met up with Farrell and McCann, who entered Gibraltar on foot around 2:30. The 3-man IRA cell then left Old Town Gibraltar and began the 4-mile walk back to the border, unaware of the deadly SAS unit laying in wait. A mile from the governor's palace, Farrell, McCann, and Savage reached a petrol station when a burst of gunshots rang out, and in less than 1 minute, all 3 were shot dead by the SAS. Neither Farrell, McCann, or Savage were carrying any weapons, nor did the car Savage left behind have any explosives inside. And while the SAS claimed to have told the IRA team to surrender, not a single resident in the flats overlooking the petrol station recalled hearing the SAS yell out anything before they shot, with one resident saying she saw Farrell and McCann with their hands in the air when the SAS fired without warning, before firing again as their bodies lay on the ground. The killings triggered an explosion of nationalist and Republican anger, as many believed Farrell, McCann, and Savage had tried to surrender. But the SAS maintained their position that the 3 had made movements, which led the soldiers to believe they were in danger. And while no explosives were found in Savage's car, a set of keys was found in Farrell's pocket, which led police to a 3rd vehicle left behind in Marbella, inside of which 64 kilograms of Semtex was found, enough to kill everybody watching and taking part in the changing of the guard ceremony. And to give that even more reference, the Enniskillen bomb, which killed 11 and injured 63, contained 18 kilos of Semtex packed into a gym bag. If it succeeded, the bombing of Gibraltar could likely have been the most deadly ever for the Provisional IRA. And I have no doubt the SAS were there to do one thing and one thing only. Gibraltar was an absolute disaster that may well have always been destined to fail. The mission required international travel for 3 high-profile IRA operators, all at the top of intelligence watch lists, at a time when the provos were absolutely teeming with informants. And given how strategic IRA leadership was, I wonder if, given the Protestant sympathies that followed the Enniskillen bomb, the mission in Gibraltar was never actually meant to succeed. because the killing of Farrell, McCann, and Savage had another effect, turning the three would-be mass murderers into Republican martyrs gunned down in the street by the British state. Upon returning to Dublin Airport a week later on March 13th, the three bodies were brought in a cortege to the Belfast homes of the Farrell, McCann, and Savage families, while British soldiers flooded Republican areas to prevent public displays of IRA sympathy, which led to IRA man Kevin McCracken being shot dead by the British Army on Monday, March 14th, while preparing to attack an army patrol in West Belfast. That equaled 4 dead Republicans in just over a week. And on Wednesday, March 16th, thousands of mourners and the world's press gathered at Milltown Cemetery in West Belfast for the funerals of Farrell, Savage, and McCann. Similar high-level IRA funerals had been heavily policed by cops in riot gear, but after calls from the Catholic Church and nationalist SDLP, the police decided to keep their distance, which gave loyalist UDA gunman Michael Stone the perfect opportunity to strike. As Father Alec Reed began his prayer at Milltown, he looked up and saw movement on the edge of the crowd. It was the burly loyalist Stone in a dark jacket and cap, walking towards the mourners at Milltown with an unsettling purpose. Reaching into his jacket, Stone wound up and hurled a grenade into the crowd. Mourners hid behind headstones as the sharp crack of an explosion rang out, and people flew into complete panic, running in every direction as Stone began shooting into the crowd. Republican leader Jerry Adams then hopped on the microphone and told everyone to stay calm as a second grenade exploded in the background. Dozens of mourners started to sprint towards Stone, but before they could reach him, Stone pulled out his pistol and began shooting again. A slow-motion chase followed as Stone backed out of the cemetery, periodically firing shots and chucking grenades, advancing towards the M1 motorway as mourners weaved in and out of headstones for cover. By the time Stone reached the M1, he had run out of ammunition as the mourners converged on him and beat Stone unconscious. And there would have been little doubt about Stone's fate if police officers didn't suspiciously arrive moments later to arrest him. Stone left 3 men dead: 20-year-old Catholic Thomas Mackerlane, 26-year-old Catholic John Murray, and 30-year-old IRA volunteer Kevin Brady. One frustrated Republican screamed again and again, "Thousands of us here, and not a fucking gun between us." Stone would later say his attack at Milltown was a response to the Enniskillen bomb, just like the failed Gibraltar attack, which led to the doomed funerals. A second giant funeral was arranged for Saturday, March 19th, to bury the 3 victims of the Milltown attack. And after attending the funeral mass of Kevin Brady, Father Alec Reed walked out of the church to the huge funeral cortege making its way down the Andersonstown Road. Brady had been a cab driver, and a small fleet of black taxis drove along as the guard of honor towards Milltown Cemetery, where Thomas Mackerlane, John Murray, and Kevin Brady would be buried in the same ground where they lost their lives days earlier. But as Father Reed walked towards Brady's coffin, a silver Volkswagen appeared on the road coming towards the cortege. The vehicle then suddenly sped ahead before coming to an abrupt stop ahead of the taxis and reversing at high speed before being engulfed by people. There were 2 men inside the car, plain-clothed British Army corporals, David Howes and Derek Wood, who had taken a wrong turn down the Falls Road after leaving their barracks. Wood partially climbed out the window and fired into the air. The crowd scattered back before surging on the Volkswagen and dragging the 2 corporals out of the car and into a nearby park. Corporals Howe and Wood were then stripped by the mob and beaten to a pulp. That's when Father Reed approached, sensing the men were about to be shot. Reed got onto the ground between the two soldiers, wrapped one arm around each, and cried out for an ambulance. But that's also when he heard a voice above him say, "Get up, or I'll fucking shoot you," as a pair of hands pulled Father Reed away from the soldiers. Corporals Howes and Wood were then thrown into a black taxi and driven to a vacant lot 200 yards away. Father Reed ran towards the area when he heard the unmistakable crack of gunshots, and when he arrived at the lot, the two men were laid out on rubble, covered in blood, limbs pointing in all directions. In the sky above, a helicopter circled, but security services did nothing to intervene, likely knowing it would only have made things worse. As Father Reed approached the soldiers, one of them was clearly dead, while the other struggled to breathe. Reed noticed people standing around and asked if anyone knew CPR, but the crowd just stood there and watched. And as Reed then tried to breathe life into the soldier himself, someone yelled out, "Father, that man is dead." Corporal David Howes was 23 and had just arrived in Northern Ireland, while 24-year-old Corporal Derek Wood was about to complete his 4-year tour. Father Reed didn't know if the men were Catholic, but he anointed both, just as he anointed the bodies of the slain mourners at Milltown Cemetery days earlier. Within 2 weeks, 5 provosts, 2 Catholic civilians, and 2 members of the British Army were dead, all a product of the failed Enniskillen bomb that killed 10 Protestant civilians and a police officer the previous November. No one would ever be prosecuted for the Enniskillen bomb, but IRA men Alex Murphy and Harry Maguire would each receive a minimum of 25 years in prison for the murders of Corporals David Howes and Derek Wood, and at Michael Stone's trial for the murders of Thomas Mackerlane, John Murray, and Kevin Brady. He confessed to killing an additional 3 Catholic civilians between 1984 and 1987. And received a total of 684 years in prison for 6 murders. All 3 would be released by the year 2000 under the controversial terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And 3 years after that, the psychopath Stone published an autobiography where he wrote the words, "I didn't choose killing, killing chose me."